It is the night of April 6, 1862. The rain is coming down hard on Pittsburg Landing, Tennessee, and the Union Army is broken. Not retreating, not regrouping. Broken. Thousands of soldiers, estimates range from 5 to 10,000 men, have abandoned their units and are huddled under the bluff at the river's edge, sheltering from the rain and from the battle they have been running from since dawn. Officers who ride among them to push them back into the fight find men who will not move, cannot be shamed, cannot be threatened back into the line. They are done. The river is at their backs. There is nowhere left to go. Somewhere behind them, in the camps they fled from that morning, the Confederate Army is sleeping on the ground it has taken. General P.G.T. Beauregard has already sent a telegram to Richmond claiming a complete and glorious victory. He believes the work is finished. He will complete it in the morning. And under a tree near the landing, standing in the rain because he cannot bring himself to go inside the house that has been turned into a field hospital, the sound of the surgeons, the sound of the men on the tables, Ulysses Grant stands on crutches, alone, hat pulled low, cigar burning in the dark. He has been on crutches for days, since a horse fell on his ankle. He arrived at this battlefield by steamboat this morning, hours after the fighting had already begun, to find his army disintegrating around him. He has spent the day trying to hold a line that kept moving backward. He has watched division after division give ground. He has watched thousands of his men abandon the fight and run to the river. He has done what he could, which was less than what was needed, and now he is standing in the rain with the river at his back and a Confederate army between him and anything that could be called success. He has been here before, not on this battlefield, but in this position, the position of a man whom circumstances have conspired to destroy. This is the second time in 6 weeks that his career is ending. The first time, it was Halleck who ended it, with paperwork and rumor. This time, it is 44,000 Confederate soldiers and the worst military surprise in the Western theater of the war. William Sherman finds him there. Sherman's division took the first Confederate blow that morning. Sherman has been shot through the hand and had 3 horses killed under him. He has had as bad a day as any general on the field. He comes to Grant intending to say something about falling back, about crossing the river, about the situation being beyond recovery. He looks at Grant's face and says something else instead. "Well, Grant," he says, "we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" Grant draws on the cigar. "Yes," he says, "lick 'em tomorrow, though." That exchange, documented in Sherman's own memoirs, cited by every serious historian of the battle, is the hinge on which this entire story turns. Because in those few words, in that moment under the tree in the Tennessee rain, something is revealed about Ulysses Grant that the rest of the war will confirm again and again, that the thing which made him different from the men around him was not brilliance, not strategic genius, not the gifts that made Jackson's marches and Lee's audacity the stuff of legend. It was the specific, almost inhuman inability to accept that a bad situation was a finished one. He shouldn't have been there. He shouldn't have survived to stand under that tree. The failures that had brought his army to this moment were real, documented, and serious. And the story of why he survived anyway on the field and then in the newspapers and in Washington, where the second battle was fought, is the story this video is going to tell. If this kind of history lands for you, hit like and subscribe. It helps keep this channel going. To understand how Grant ended up standing under that tree, you have to understand how close he came to never arriving at Shiloh at all. In February of 1862, Ulysses Grant had the best 6 weeks of any Union general in the war. Fort Henry fell on February 6th. Fort Donelson fell on February 16th, with approximately 15,000 Confederate prisoners, the largest capture of enemy forces in American military history to that point. The North exploded in celebration. His initials, U.S., were said to stand for unconditional surrender. He was promoted to Major General. He was, for a few weeks, the most famous man in the Union Army. Then his commanding officer, Henry Halleck, received reports. Some were documented, some were rumor. Grant had been drinking. He had left his command without authorization. He was not filing proper reports. Whether these specific charges were true or were exaggerated by men who found Grant difficult to manage, and Halleck found many generals difficult to manage, the result was the same. Halleck relieved Grant of field command in early March and gave his army to C.F. Smith. Grant was sitting at his headquarters with no authority and nothing to do, composing letters that touched on the subject of resignation, when C.F. Smith solved the problem for him by developing a severe foot infection from a minor scratch and becoming too ill to command. Halleck reluctantly gave the army back to Grant. This matters. The man at the center of the Shiloh disaster is a man who has already been nearly removed from the war once, who has returned to command not through any particular merit he demonstrated in the interval, but because his replacement got sick. He comes back to an army whose planning he has not been part of, in a campaign whose logistics and strategic context have been developing without him, and takes command of approximately 42,000 men encamped on the west bank of the Tennessee River at a place called Pittsburg Landing. The strategic situation is straightforward. Wait for Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio to arrive from Nashville, then combine the two forces for an advance on Corinth, Mississippi, 20 miles to the southwest, where the Confederate Army under Albert Sidney Johnston is concentrated. The combined force would give Grant a significant numerical advantage. The plan requires patience, not a quality Grant is celebrated for, but in this case, a sound approach. What Grant does while waiting, and what he does not do, is where the story of April 6th begins. He does not entrench. This is the central, non-negotiable failure of Grant's pre-battle dispositions at Shiloh, and it must be stated plainly. 42,000 men are camped on a plateau between two creeks with the Tennessee River at their backs. The terrain is naturally strong in some respects. The creek lines on the flanks limit the avenues of Confederate approach. But Grant does not order his division commanders to construct fieldworks. He does not order his men to dig in. The reasons offered at the time and afterward, that entrenching would signal defensive intent, that it would be bad for morale, that the army was preparing to advance rather than defend, reflect a military culture that had not yet absorbed what rifled weapons and hasty fieldworks would mean for Civil War combat. They do not change what the failure cost. The reconnaissance failure compounds the first. Johnston begins his approach march from Corinth on April 3rd with approximately 45,000 men. The march is chaotic. Units lose their way, officers argue about timing, accidental weapons discharges occur among Confederate soldiers moving through the Tennessee countryside. Beauregard, Johnston's second-in-command, argues before the march begins that surprise has been lost and the attack should be abandoned. Johnston overrules him. Grant's forward commanders are picking up signs of Confederate movement. William Sherman, commanding the division furthest from the river, receives reports from his pickets of Confederate troops in the woods. He dismisses them. On April 5th, the day before the attack, Sherman writes to Grant that he does not apprehend anything like an attack on their position. Grant, 9 miles downriver at his headquarters in Savannah, Tennessee, relying on the judgment of his forward commanders, does not order a general alert. The failures are Grant's. Not entirely, not exclusively. Sherman owns the reconnaissance dismissal, and the Confederate approach march was loud enough that any reasonably alert forward screen should have identified it. But Grant commands the army. The absence of entrenchments is his decision or his failure to make a decision. The absence from the battlefield on the night of April 5th, he is at Savannah, on crutches, 9 miles from the position that is about to be attacked, compounds everything. What follows on April 6th is the consequence of those failures, delivered in full. The Confederate assault begins at approximately 5 in the morning on April 6th, when skirmishers from Hardee's Corps make contact with Union pickets in front of Sherman's division. Within an hour, Johnston's entire army is attacking across a 3-mile front. The surprise is not complete. Some Union commanders have enough warning to form their men, but it is sufficient. Sherman's division, despite Sherman's pre-battle dismissal of the threat, is hit hard and forced back almost immediately. Prentiss's division, in the center of the Union line, is struck before it can form a coherent defensive position. Unit after unit is driven out of its camp before the men inside it have finished breakfast, struggling to find their weapons and their regiments in the chaos of a camp being overrun at dawn. The Union line collapses in stages, bending southward toward the river through the morning. Grant arrives at Pittsburg Landing at approximately 8:30, still on crutches, and rides into a battle that has been going wrong for 3 hours. He cannot run. He cannot mount and dismount quickly. He moves from position to position across the field on a horse, trying to understand a situation that is changing faster than the reports reaching him. What he finds at the landing when he arrives is documented in accounts that are impossible to read without registering the scale of the collapse. Thousands of Union soldiers have broken from their units and run to the riverbank. They are under the bluff, sheltering from the fire and from the battle, refusing or unable to return. Officers who ride among them to rally them find men who cannot be moved. The river is at their backs. There is nowhere to retreat to, and they are already retreating. Grant does not attempt a general withdrawal. He cannot. The river makes withdrawal impossible without boats he does not have. What he does instead is what he will do across every crisis of the next 3 years. He holds what can be held, reinforces what can be reinforced, and refuses to name the situation as finished. In the center of the battlefield, Benjamin Prentiss's division makes a stand in a sunken road that will afterward be called the Hornet's Nest. The road provides marginal cover. The surrounding terrain channels Confederate attackers into killing ground. Prentiss's men repulse assault after assault through the afternoon. Traditional accounts say 12 charges, though the precise number of distinct assault waves is disputed by some historians. What is documented is that the Confederate effort against the Hornet's Nest consumes hours and enormous quantities of ammunition that Johnston's army cannot easily replace. Eventually, Prentiss is surrounded by Confederate forces and surrenders with approximately 2,200 men at around 5:30 in the evening. He has bought time. The cost of that time becomes visible when you look at what it has bought. Albert Sidney Johnston is dead. He was struck by a bullet behind his right knee during the afternoon fighting, probably from Union fire. The wound severs an artery. His staff, not recognizing the severity of the injury, does not apply a tourniquet. His personal physician, Dr. D.W. Yandell, is not present. Johnston had sent him away earlier to tend to wounded Union prisoners at his own orders, an act of generosity toward the enemy that becomes, in retrospect, one of the more tragic ironies of the battle. Johnston bleeds to death in a ravine at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, at the moment when his army is making its deepest penetrations of the Union position. Beauregard assumes command. By late afternoon, the Union Army has been pushed back to a final defensive line approximately half a mile from Pittsburg Landing. The line is not heroic. It is the last available ground before the river. But on that ground, Grant has concentrated approximately 50 artillery pieces on the high bluff above the landing, supported by gunboats on the river whose fire can reach Confederate assault columns. The Confederate attacks against this final position are repulsed. The guns hold. As darkness falls and the rain begins, Beauregard suspends the attack. His army is exhausted, its ammunition is depleted, and its commanding general has been dead since mid-afternoon. Beauregard believes he has essentially won. The completion, he reasons, can wait until morning. He sends his telegram to Richmond. He tells Jefferson Davis, a complete victory. He does not know what is crossing the river in the darkness. The night of April 6th to 7th is when Grant's survival is decided. Not by Grant, not by any decision he makes, but by the convergence of forces that the day's fighting and the day's accidents have set in motion. Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio has been marching from Nashville. It arrives at the east bank of the Tennessee River during the evening of April 6th and begins crossing by steamboat and ferry in the darkness. Approximately 25,000 men who have not fired a shot cross the river through the night and take their positions on the Union left. By dawn, Grant's effective force has nearly doubled. Lew Wallace's division, approximately 7,000 men from Grant's own army who have been absent all day, arrives during the night as well. Wallace has been marching toward the battle since morning, but took the wrong road and spent the day on the wrong side of the battlefield. Whether the fault is Wallace's or whether Grant's orders were ambiguous enough to produce the confusion is a question the two men argued about for the rest of their lives and historians have not settled. What is documented is that Wallace's division was absent for the entirety of April 6th and arrived in time for April 7th. By dawn on April 7th, Grant has approximately 55,000 men, the majority of them fresh. Beauregard has an exhausted, ammunition-depleted army that has been fighting all day, has lost its commanding general, and is now significantly outnumbered. Grant attacks at first light. The Confederate army is pushed back across the entire battlefield through April 7th, back across the Hornet's nest, back across the ground taken at such cost the previous day, back toward Corinth. Beauregard, recognizing the situation is irreversible, orders a retreat. By afternoon, the battle is over. The army that should have been finished on April 6th has counterattacked, recovered all the ground it lost, and driven the Confederate force from the field. Grant, standing under that tree in the rain the night before, had said, "Lick 'em tomorrow," though he had not been wrong. But the honest account of why he was able to lick them tomorrow is not simple. Buell's army, Wallace's division, Johnston's death removing the Confederate commander at the critical moment, Beauregard's decision to halt on the evening of April 6th rather than press the final 400 yards to the river. Prentices stand in the Hornet's nest, buying the hours needed for Buell to arrive. The artillery on the bluff holding the final line. These are the factors that saved Grant's army on April 6th, and most of them are not factors Grant controlled. He controlled his refusal to retreat. He controlled his decision to hold the last line rather than attempt a crossing. He controlled the placement of the artillery on the bluff. And he controlled the thing that Sherman saw in his face under the tree, the decision, made somewhere below the level of conscious strategy, that this situation was not finished. That decision is real. Its importance should not be minimized, but neither should the weight of what came to him from outside, the reinforcements crossing the river in the darkness, the Confederate general bleeding to death in the afternoon, the Confederate commander stopping short of the river when the river was almost within reach. Grant survived Shiloh. The honest account of why he survived it requires holding all of these things at once. Shiloh was not over when the guns stopped on April 7th. For Ulysses Grant, the more dangerous engagement was just beginning. The casualty figures, when they became public, produced a reaction in the Northern press and in Congress that no military victory could absorb cleanly. Approximately 13,000 Union casualties across 2 days, approximately 24,000 total casualties combined. Families across Ohio and Illinois and Indiana received the letters that families receive in wartime, and behind those letters was the question that the newspapers were already asking. Why? Why had Grant's army been surprised? Why had there been no entrenchments? Where had Grant been on the morning of April 6th? And the question that followed the others like a shadow, had he been drinking? The drunk charge was not new. It had been part of the Halleck dossier that nearly removed Grant before Shiloh. It now returned with the weight of a military disaster behind it. Newspapers that had celebrated him after Fort Donelson described him in terms that ranged from incompetent to criminal. Congressional voices called for his removal. Halleck, who had arrived in person to take direct command of the combined armies after the battle, effectively sidelined Grant again, this time by giving him the meaningless title of second-in-command, a position with no operational authority and no meaningful role. Grant, for the second time in 2 months, was a general with no army to command. The drinking question surrounding Shiloh has never been definitively resolved. The serious Grant biographers, Gene Edward Smith, Ron Chernow, have examined the evidence carefully and concluded that the documentary record does not support the claim that intoxication affected Grant's performance before or during the battle. What they also acknowledge is that Grant's longer-term relationship with alcohol was real, complicated, and never fully resolved across the arc of his career. The charges made against him in April 1862 deserve to be named as charges, serious ones, made by serious people, without being presented as established fact. The honest answer is that we do not know, and anyone who tells you they do is giving you more certainty than the evidence supports. What we do know is what Lincoln did. When the political pressure to remove Grant reached Lincoln, and it did from multiple directions, in the weeks following Shiloh, Lincoln's response has been documented in the most frequently cited line he uttered about any military commander in the war. The precise wording varies across the accounts that preserve it, and the identity of the person Lincoln was responding to also varies, but the substance is consistent. "I can't spare this man. He fights." That sentence is Lincoln's entire strategic judgment in 8 words. It is not a defense of Grant's specific decisions at Shiloh. It is not an assessment of whether the entrenchments should have been dug or the reconnaissance should have been better. It is a judgment about what the war required and where the war would go if the man who had taken Fort Henry and Fort Donelson was removed because he had allowed his army to be surprised. Lincoln's judgment was correct, and it was not self-evident. The case for removing Grant in the spring of 1862 was not an unreasonable case by the standards of the information available at the time. He had been surprised, his army had nearly been destroyed, the casualties were catastrophic, and the charges against him were not invented out of nothing. Lincoln could have removed him. The political incentive to remove him was considerable. He did not. Grant considered leaving anyway. The sidelining by Halleck, the meaningless title, the absence of any operational role, had brought him to the same place he had been in March, a general without a command. Watching the army he should be leading from a position that had no authority attached to it, he began to think about going home, about whether there was any point in staying. Sherman stopped him. Their documented exchange, Sherman telling Grant that if he stayed, events would justify him, that if he left he would regret it, that the war was not over and his part in it was not finished, appears in Sherman's memoirs. It is, like the conversation under the tree, a moment where Sherman's role in Grant's survival is clearer than the histories that focus only on Grant usually acknowledge. Sherman found Grant under the tree on the night of April 6th and changed what Grant was about to say. Sherman found Grant considering resignation in the weeks that followed and changed what Grant was about to do. The Grant who goes on to Vicksburg, who captures 29,000 Confederate soldiers on July 4, 1863, who is brought east by Lincoln in March of 1864 and given command of all Union armies, who drives Lee into the siege of Petersburg and forces the surrender at Appomattox, that Grant is built on 2 survivals at Shiloh. The survival on the field on April 6th and 7th, 1862. And the survival in Washington and in the press in the weeks that followed, which was made possible by Lincoln's judgment and by Sherman's insistence that the war was not done with him yet. Shiloh has a specific place in Grant's biography that is different from any other battle he fought, and it is not primarily the place that the battle's tactical history assigns to it. It is the place where the essential Grant is revealed, not the Grant of the mythology, the cigar-smoking engine of unconditional surrender, the figure that the popular history of the war has constructed from the angle of his eventual victory. The real Grant at Shiloh is a man standing in the rain on crutches with thousands of his soldiers huddled at the riverbank behind him and a Confederate army between him and anything that looks like victory, and he is not done. He is not done in the way that is most difficult to explain and most important to understand, not because he has a plan, not because he has reinforcements he knows are coming. He does not know, on the evening of April 6th, exactly when Buell will arrive or what Lew Wallace's division is doing on the wrong road somewhere in the Tennessee countryside. He is not done because the alternative, treating this situation as finished, is not available to him. Not as a matter of courage, not as a posture, but as something deeper and harder to articulate, the specific quality of mind that refuses to draw the line where other minds would draw it. The argument for removing Grant from the war after Shiloh was not a foolish argument. The failures that produced the near disaster of April 6th were real. A general who entrenched his position, who maintained adequate reconnaissance, who was on the battlefield on the night before the attack rather than 9 miles downriver, might have prevented the disaster entirely. Grant's survival of Shiloh does not erase those failures or transform them into virtues. What it establishes instead is the specific shape of the man that Lincoln decided he could not spare. Not a perfect general, there is no such thing, and the Civil War produced more evidence for that conclusion than any conflict in American history. Not a general without flaws that cost men their lives. but a general who, when the situation had deteriorated as far as Shiloh deteriorated on the evening of April 6, 1862, could stand in the rain under a tree, draw on his cigar, and mean it when he said, "Lick 'em tomorrow, though." The Confederate general who attacked him that morning was Albert Sidney Johnston, the man Jefferson Davis considered the finest soldier in the Confederacy. Johnston is dead before the day is over, bleeding in a ravine from a wound a tourniquet would have closed. The general who replaces Johnston, Beauregard, sends a telegram to Richmond claiming victory before the victory is complete and suspends his attack 400 yards from the river. The general whom Washington nearly removes twice survives the battle, and the politics and the press and the meaningless title Halleck gives him and the resignation he almost submits, because a president with the specific kind of strategic clarity that Lincoln possessed looks at the record and draws a line in 8 words. "I can't spare this man, he fights." 3 years later, at Appomattox, Lee surrenders to Grant. The man who should not have survived Shiloh is the man who ends the war. The line between those two facts runs through a rainy night in Tennessee, a conversation under a tree, a president who refused to do what everyone was telling him to do, and a general who could not, even when everything had gone wrong, bring himself to call it finished. That is not mythology, that is Ulysses Grant read straight.